For decades, we've kind of pictured malnutrition simply as a lack of food, right? Just a calorie deficit. But today, our goal is to completely shatter that paradigm. We've got to move away from viewing this simply as not enough grain to understanding the deep, systemic, and highly structural web of causes that keeps malnutrition persisting today. So let's dive right into this masterclass on how agriculture, sanitation, gender inequality, and governance all collide to produce actual human health outcomes.
Okay, the absolutely crucial starting point here is that we have to separate the concept of hunger from malnutrition. Hunger is that painful, temporary physical sensation of just not having enough food energy. Think of it like a warning light on your dashboard. Malnutrition, on the other hand, is the engine actually breaking down. It's an outcome. It's a biological state covering everything from chronic undernutrition, like stunting and wasting, to micronutrient deficiencies and increasingly overweight and obesity. This distinction is so vital because it establishes a baseline fact. Maintaining massive national food stocks or having overflowing granaries absolutely does not automatically equal good human nutrition. You can consume plenty of calories and still be profoundly malnourished.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll cover the multiple burden, systemic causes, the life cycle and gender, institutional bottlenecks, and finally, wrap up with a blueprint for reform.
Let's jump straight into Section 1, the multiple burden.
So, looking at the latest National Family Health Survey data, we see something that perfectly captures what we call the multiple burden paradox. Take a look at the progress. Chronic child undernutrition, or stunting, has impressively dropped from about 35.5% down to 29%. That's great. But here is the paradox we really have to ask ourselves about. How can child stunting drop while severe wasting, which is acute weight loss, remains stubbornly stuck right around 19%? And wait, at the exact same time in the exact same population, the rate of adult women who are overweight or obese has sharply spiked from 24% to nearly 31%. No way, right? How does that happen?
Well, to understand that paradox, you just have to look at what people are actually eating. According to the latest Household Consumption Expenditure Survey, nearly 46% of protein in rural areas still comes from simple carbohydrates like cereals. This exposes a massive gap in dietary diversity. I mean, the calories are certainly there, but the pulses, eggs, milk, fruits, and veggies, they're glaringly absent.
So to summarize what we're seeing, India is experiencing a double and sometimes even a triple burden, right inside the exact same communities and frankly even the same households. The country has achieved some really solid partial success in fighting chronic food shortages, but it's now rapidly transitioning into a crisis of diet quality. We're seeing persistent undernutrition side by side with a massive rise in adult overweight and diet-related non-communicable diseases.
Which brings us to Section 2, systemic causes. We need to look beyond just calories.
Malnutrition persists because the root causes are entirely structural. Yes, household food insecurity definitely matters. When food inflation hits, families squeeze their budgets and they drop those expensive proteins for cheap carbs. But look closely at the second point, the wash environment: water, sanitation, and hygiene. If a child is repeatedly exposed to unsafe water, they develop environmental enteric dysfunction. Basically, their gut literally cannot absorb nutrients anymore. A government can distribute tons of free grain, but grain cannot cure a waterborne infection. Add to this overlapping poverty, deep social exclusion for tribal and marginalized communities, and commercial determinants like the incredibly aggressive marketing of high-sugar, ultra-processed junk foods, and you've got a full-blown systemic crisis.
And this is exactly why we must upgrade our policy language. A food security approach focuses on national availability, tons of grain distributed, and making sure there are enough staple calories to prevent starvation. A nutrition security approach, however, demands diverse diets, it addresses individual life cycle needs, and it measures success by actual tangible health outcomes. Now, don't get me wrong, the National Food Security Act is an indispensable, legally claimable floor that prevents hunger. It is absolutely vital. But it is just the floor. It is not the ceiling for actual nutrition security.
Moving into Section 3, the life cycle and gender trap. Let's see how we can break it.
What you're looking at here is the intergenerational cycle of malnutrition. It's like a giant, tragic puzzle. It starts with an undernourished adolescent girl. Because of intense social norms, she might face early marriage and a high-risk early pregnancy where maternal and fetal growth are actually competing for nutrients. She has low weight gain during pregnancy. This leads to a low birth weight infant who is highly susceptible to infections. That child experiences stunting, which impairs their cognitive development, their future learning, and ultimately their adult earning capacity. They end up in poverty, and the whole cycle just repeats itself. The absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this is a systemic policy failure. It is not a biological inevitability. We can break this chain.
And the absolute best time to break that chain? The first 1,000 days. From the exact moment of conception right up to a child's second birthday, fetal and early child growth is incredibly rapid. Any deprivation during this critical window causes damage that is almost always permanent. Trying to play catch-up later is nearly impossible. This is exactly why interventions have got to be laser-focused right here.
But, and this is a big but, as we focus on the child, we must never lose sight of this profound truth. Women are not merely instruments for child nutrition. A true rights-based approach demands that we entirely reject the victim-blaming of mothers. Far too often, policy only values women as mothers, expecting them to somehow perfectly nourish a child while completely denying them their own basic entitlements to adequate nutrition, bodily autonomy, rest, and dignified work. So, what do these gender pathways causing malnutrition actually look like on the ground? Well, they're deeply structural. Take time poverty, when women are burdened with hours of unpaid care work, cooking and collecting water or firewood. This literally leaves them no time for adequate infant feeding or even going to a clinic. Then look at intra-household allocation, where women and girls often eat last or least. And crucially, informal employment. Without paid maternity leave, breastfeeding breaks, or full-day creches at work sites, optimal infant feeding practices are structurally impossible. This completely redefines the narrative, moving it away from individual parental failures to a massive failure of our care infrastructure.
All right, Section 4, Institutional and Governance Bottlenecks. India actually has massive, ambitious programs like Poshan 2.0 and Anemia Mukt Bharat. So why do they struggle? The biggest bottleneck is fragmented governance. Malnutrition requires synchronized action from health, education, food, and water departments. But convergence often just stays a buzzword. Departments have meetings, sure, but they fail to share joint targets, pooled budgets, or actual accountability for a specific child's recovery. On top of that, our frontline capacity is stretched to the absolute limit. Anganwadi workers face low honoraria, massive staff vacancies, and they're burdened with heavy digital data entry workloads. And when they do get time to counsel families, it's often generic messaging like, eat a balanced diet. Honestly, that's useless if a family simply can't afford those foods.
We also really have to talk about sedentary bias. This is a major blind spot in our modern era of rapid urbanization. Our welfare architecture basically assumes a family stays in one village forever. While digital portability systems like the One Nation, One Ration card brilliantly move food grain across state lines, they totally fail to move continuous care. A migrant construction worker might be able to get her portable grain, but her child completely misses out on the local Anganwadi, local immunizations, and local childcare facilities.
Another massive bottleneck is the illusion that data automatically equals care. Millions of children are logged into the Poshan Tracker app every single month, but data without action? That's just centralized visibility. Simply logging a child's low weight into a smartphone app does not cure severe acute malnutrition. Measurement only adds value if it triggers a closed-loop health referral, meaning the child is classified correctly, referred to a medical facility, treated, and then the recovery is actually verified back in the community.
Finally, let's move to Section 5, a comprehensive reform blueprint.
So how do we fix it? Here are the 5 core pillars of reform. First up, make those first 1,000 days fully operational by guaranteeing inflation index maternity support. Second, we need to transform Anganwadis from just feeding centers into full-day early childhood hubs. Third, diversify the food security system way beyond just rice and wheat. We need to adopt proportionate universalism, which basically means providing a strong baseline for everyone, but intensive targeted support where it's needed most. Fourth, put women's agency and care infrastructure at the absolute center of the policy. And fifth, build a complete continuum of care for wasting, starting from community detection all the way to clinical treatment and relapse prevention.
Now, you can't fix these structural issues overnight. It requires really careful sequencing. In the immediate 0 to 2 year window, the priority is simple. Fill those frontline vacancies, pay workers on time, and just restore basic service reliability. Moving into the medium term, say 3 to 5 years, we need to create district nutrition authorities that share common budgets to literally force that departmental convergence we talked about. And structurally, looking 5 years and beyond, we must institutionalize independent nutrition surveillance and align agricultural procurement to actually support diverse diets. We've got to shift from immediate crisis response to deeply rooted, systemic food system transformations.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves as we wrap up this explainer. Will we continue simply counting tons of grain distributed and digital app entries made, or will we finally transition to a system that guarantees healthy, diverse, and sustainable diets for all? The demographic dividend we talk so much about. It is only potential until every single child receives the food, the care, and the environment they need in those critical first 1,000 days. It is time to shift from a scheme-centric past to a true rights-based human capital future. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. See you next time.